Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today's lecture focuses on controversial election laws. The United States Constitution is actually quite slim when it comes to describing elections, and it allocates most authority over elections to the state governments. So that tends to give rise to a number of controversial election laws across states or differences in how states administer their elections. These different laws include postal voting or voting by mail, gerrymandering, and photo identification laws. In this lecture, we'll talk about some of these controversial election laws, why they're controversial, and importantly, what some research has to say about the effects of these laws on elections. So what does the US Constitution say about elections? Not very much, to be honest. So the Constitution outlines only very basic procedures for electing federal officials, not state officials, but federal officials, such as the qualifications for president, who is elected by the Electoral College on a single day, and qualifications for members of Congress, including their age, who are popularly elected according to the Constitution. Most of the administration of elections is left to the states. Under the original Constitution, the states were largely able to determine who could cast a vote and who could not. The states conduct elections according to our current Constitution, mostly by determining the times, places, and manners under which elections take place. So in other words, the Constitution does not specify an election date in November. It does not mention polling locations or hours or ballot access, for example. Instead, those are left up to the states. Congress can still establish some standards for federal elections, and it's done so in the past, and that's often brought state elections to be on the same day, since Congress has mandated that elections for members of Congress all be on the same day as well in the 1800s. But a lot of these details remain within the purview of the state legislatures. The Constitution does specify, not originally, but now that there are amendments, it does specify who has the right to vote, or at least qualifications for voting. It specifies grounds on which no one can be excluded for the right to vote, for example. So the Constitution is very clear in specifying that the right to vote cannot be denied or abridged based on gender or race, for example. However, states still have a fair amount of leeway, such as determining whether felons have the right to vote or not. And so a lot of these questions of controversial election laws often fall on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. That is, are some people being denied the equal protection of the law under the US Constitution because a state's election law is somehow discriminatory? So what are some controversial election laws in the states? We won't cover all of these, but some of you are probably already familiar with a number of these laws. Gerrymandering is a controversial thing at the state level. There are identification requirements for voters, such as whether voters must present a photo ID. There is postal voting or mail-by voting. Part of the controversy with this is whether the ballots can be counted or if there might be fraud. There is ballot collection, also pejoratively referred to as ballot harvesting, ballot design, and of course, felon voting rights. Let's talk a bit more about identification requirements, postal voting, ballot collection, and ballot design, and what the research might have to say. Over the past 20 years in particular, a number of states have moved away from the federal minimum for identification for voting to a more strict form of identification. There's a federal law that requires that identification be required, and that is in effect in all states. But over the past 20 years, a number of states have moved beyond this to require photo identification as required. And so the Help America Vote Act, the HAVA, established that minimum ID requirement. And a number of states have now moved to non-strict, non-photo IDs. That's what they accept, meaning that the ID does not necessarily have to include a photo, and the law is not necessarily enforced on the exact same election day. There's also non-strict photo identification, meaning that you can verify your photo identification after Election Day. But then we have strict photo laws, which are your more controversial examples, and strict non-photo laws as well. As I said, these strict photo laws tend to be the more controversial. These are the laws that require that someone present a photo identification and that they present that some point around Election Day in order for their vote to be counted. So do these kinds of laws make a difference? Why are they controversial? 34 states require voters to show identification at the polls, but advocates argue that such laws make for more transparent elections that are less susceptible to fraud or corruption. Detractors, however, argue that such laws discourage voting by minority voters who are less likely to have identification documents. And in particular, they argue that ID requirements may be selectively enforced based on race by local officials. Studies generally have found inconsistent effects, however, on whether or not these strict photo ID laws make a difference. Some even argue that it is nearly impossible to estimate the effect of these laws, since the presence of such a law can encourage a counter-mobilization and encourage turnout by voters that find the laws offensive, for example. Research is ongoing. There's also postal voting, or voting by mail. This type of law has gained renewed attention due to the COVID-19 pandemic. A number of states made new laws or allowed for more generous requirements that would allow for more people to vote by mail because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Does it benefit either party for there to be voting by mail? Recent research shows that postal voting tends to increase turnout, but it doesn't affect the vote share of the parties per se. So voting by mail may increase turnout, but it doesn't necessarily matter to which party may win an elected office. We have seen, however, that this does improve turnout among lower income voters, but more low income white voters are voting Republican, so the partisan effects may be even among whites. There's some reason to believe that postal voting may hurt Democrats, since younger, more Democratic voters move around more, and so their addresses may not be reliable, so their ballots may be sent to the wrong addresses. But postal voting may also hurt Republicans, since rural ballots may take longer to arrive in the mail. Since these rural voters tend to vote more often for Republican candidates, yet they live out in a more isolated location, the mail service tends to take longer. And fraud is always a possibility, of course, but effective fraud is more likely to get detected. So in other words, the bigger the fraud, the more likely it is to change an election outcome, but also the more likely it is to get detected. Smaller fraud is less likely to be detected, but also less likely to actually change an election outcome. How do we know these things about voting by mail? Prior to the pandemic, 5 states allowed voting by mail already: Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. California allowed some counties to allow for postal voting as well. And it's optional in 33 other states. In Arizona as well, there is postal voting, with a full 75 to 80% of voters being on what is called a permanent early voting list. That is, they receive ballots in the mail. When it comes to these other states, however, these are states that have all of their voters vote by mail, and there may not be ballot or polling locations. In Arizona, however, there are polling locations, and many people, about 25%, choose to vote in person as opposed to by mail. It does take longer for the results of these postal votes or mail votes to be counted, however. Some states have laws that prevent the envelopes from being opened and the votes from being counted until the night of Election Day. A third controversial law, including one that is quite relevant to Arizona, is related to ballot collection. In 2016, the Arizona legislature banned the collection and submission of ballots by people other than the voters, their relatives or their caretakers. This practice is pejoratively referred to as ballot harvesting, and those who ban the practice often say that it encourages fraud. So the idea here is that someone other than the voters may gather ballots from registered voters who have filled out their postal ballots, and then take those ballots and submit them to a post office or submit them to a county recorder's office. Democrats have claimed that banning the practice actually disenfranchises minority and Native communities, particularly those in rural or more isolated communities in places other than Maricopa County. The law has been ruled invalid by a federal judge in January of last year, but the decision was later appealed to the US Supreme Court, which heard the case in March of 2021. And it remains to be seen how exactly the Supreme Court will rule. They may rule in favor of the Arizona legislature or not. And also there's the question of ballot design. Here we have a ballot from Palm Beach County, Florida from the year 2000 that proved especially controversial since many people mistakenly cast votes for Pat Buchanan when in fact they chose to vote for Al Gore. If you were to put a marker or a pen into dot number 4 here, you would be voting for Pat Buchanan, but many people assume that that was in fact a vote for Al Gore, when in fact you would need to vote here for Al Gore. And so in other words, many people misunderstood that butterfly ballot used in Florida's Palm Beach County back in 2000. And Buchanan got an unusually high number of votes, about 5,000 in that one county, as opposed to having maybe 100 to 200 votes throughout other counties in the state of Florida. And as many of you might recall, Florida was won by George W. Bush by about 539 votes or so in 2000. The election had to be settled in the US Supreme Court. However, there are ballot design issues all across the country. In 2018, for example, about 430,000 absentee ballots were discarded because of unsigned envelopes. In Minnesota, for example, about 4,000 ballots had to be discarded one time in 2008 because people had forgotten to sign the envelopes in which they sent their ballots. And so Minnesota changed the envelope to make it more obvious that a signature is needed in order for the ballot to be counted. Some states fail to make it obvious, and so they try to improve the envelopes or the ballots over time to be more explanatory. Nevertheless, sometimes these accidents or bad ballot designs may appear to be nefarious. Half the states allow local elections to alert voters of missing signatures, however. And so because the US Constitution does not say a whole lot about how elections are administered, states tend to have most of the responsibilities for administering elections, including for federal officials. This has given rise to controversial election laws, of which there are many, and for which there's a lot of research. Research is ongoing.